what's really important is, in this case, it's a mess of a mess, because the whole idea, the whole concept is about the impure. So it's a very natural connection between, let's say, the form of the book and the content of the book. The only thing is that intellectuals never understand what a mess is, right? They're really sort of afraid of what a mess is. On the other hand, artists and people from aesthetics, they love a mess. So clearly, what is V2 is an aesthetic institute. So what do? They make a mess. What do you see? You see a sociobiologist, you see a politician, you see a sociologist, you see a food expert, you see an architect, you see somebody who publishes on the brutality of Nordicism. So we get like a mixture of concepts that normally, when people just pick up the book, they think, they get afraid, because it's a wide range of topics. Now on the other hand, there's something very aesthetic about the book. You pick it up, you see like you're seeing a William Morris, right? It looked like a book from the 1880s. Clearly it's a computed William Morris. It's not a handicraft book, but there's a very aesthetic notion of the whole book. Now this is really important, because normally Politics of the Impure you would understand as some kind of discussion assembly about the impure. Now that's a very Latour idea. That's very much an idea that first you got politics, so that means it is an assembly, it's a discussion, it's really about a concern about something. The other hand, it's about the impure, which is also very much a Latour idea, because it's the impure of technology and nature, right? The technology and nature. So we cannot have pure nature, right? It's not a book of monotheist theory that states that we have to go back to a pure or some kind of nature of paradise, right? It is a book that wants to accept that entanglement, what he calls an entanglement. But it is an aesthetic notion of the impure, and that makes it so incredibly different from people like Latour, because the problem with Latour is he would accept the nature, technology entanglement, but he can only accept it on the level of politics, which means there's an eternal discussion of topics. Right? The design groups will grow, politics will grow, everybody will be discussing what can be discussed, and there will never be an end. And of course, aesthetics is how you make ends, right? Aesthetics is an end in itself in that way. So the whole book is how do we conceive, it's not so much a politics of the impure, but it's an aesthetics of the impure. Now this will make people very nervous when you say there's an aesthetics of the impure. But that's what it's about. It does accept feelings that Latour never accepts, right? With him you get the actor networks, which are things, either they're like humans or they're non-humans, and they act. But in our case, they also feel, right? So there's a network of feelings and actions. And that's what V2 is so good about, right? It does accept that nature, technology, hybrid, but it accepts it only on aesthetic conditions, right? Not as a political thing. That's why in the book, we're discussing sweetness and gentleness and sympathy as much as brutality, fanaticism, and anger. Because it is about accepting that whole range of feelings. And we never say, look, that's an unnatural feeling, or that's a feeling that has been enhanced by technology, right? Which is a typical McLuhan idea, that you get feelings that are sort of initiated by technology, a Heidegger idea. So we have this idea of two things. One is there's this whole range of feelings. The other is containment, which is aesthetics. We give form. Right, so that's so interesting. For instance, about Arjan's piece, who talks about a thing that we can hardly speak about, because it's about Vikings, and it's about Northern Europe, and it's about Nordicism, and it's about dragons, and it's about blood, and it's about the soil. But it accepts it in this small contained form. It says, okay, there is brutality, but as long as we surround brutality by dragons and by myths of swords and Arthurian legends and whatever, it gets this aesthetic containment that but keeps it small. And that means there's a politics of aesthetics itself, right? So it is a political notion, but it is one of containment, right? It's not one of management, it's just managing by an estate. So that's why you see, when you open the book, you get this double notion of blood and swords and all this Northern European stuff, and all this anger and all this sweetness and all this gentleness, and there's this beautiful form to it, right? And that, of course, that mixes people up. But I'm sure that beyond the topic of the book, right, beyond sort of that notion of nature-technology hybrid, because we all experience that, there's a much deeper message, which is one of beauty, right? This is one of beauty. It's not just like we get beauty for free, or we get it from pattern books, or we read like 19th century books on aesthetics and we know how to do it. No, beauty has to be reconquered every time, over and over again. And what was our problem of the 20th century? Is we were like completely overwhelmed by the sublime, which is the big adversary of beauty. And all aesthetics were that of the sublime. And every notion of force, and every notion of fanaticism, and every notion of fear was always too large. Just think of existentialism. We were drenched in fear, we were born in fear, we were dying in fear. And there's never a containment. And of course the notion of beauty is actually you find form for these things, and you don't sort of move with this infinite flow of this vast universe of forces, which is the sublime. But there's actually a notion of beauty that you say, look, all this whole range of feelings is there, but we have to find forms for them. Yeah? And this makes it very 19th century. Right? This is really, we're sort of skipping backwards over the 20th century. We're finding forms for all these things, and we're putting them on an equal footing. Right, so they become comparable. I think that's why the book looks sort of weird, because on the one hand it looks like a design book, on the other hand you open it up and it's like a Satanist Bible, right? You get all this weird stuff on blood and fanaticism. It looks like very dark, but the form is not dark. And I think that you need to sort of go through that a bit.